For those of you who have not met me before, my name is John Delvecchio, and I have a riding school called Street Skills, and I have a book and coaching tours and an online course, and I call it the Cornering Confidence Program. This is kind of like what I've put all my effort into over the past 5 years or so. And so tonight we're going to just zero in on one part of it, and I have some props here for you, and I put in a decent amount of time thinking about how would you do a trail breaking tutorial. I mean, I'll spend half a day with people teaching them what leads up to the trail breaking technique, and so how could I do it in even an hour? But maybe it won't even take that long. So this is the tutorial. I call it a trail breaking tutorial. So first of all, what is trail breaking? All right. Now, a lot of people have heard about it. Many people have heard about it. There are people who have not still. Maybe you're a new rider. Maybe you just haven't talked to people about this. But trail breaking is a pretty common technique, at least in people's minds. Okay, of what they think it should be. So what I'm going to do is just start with the things right out of my book, as far as mantras and definitions that I speak to with the students when I have them. And this is the first, I guess, most important thing about trail breaking that I'd like to explain. First of all, trail breaking is not a breaking technique. Okay, trail breaking is an advanced cornering technique. All right, so the purpose of braking is to slow your motorcycle. The purpose of trail breaking is to corner with 100% control. And I usually have my students sort of repeat the phrases with me. So I'm going to give you guys, you can pause, I'll watch your lips, but just kind of repeat these two phrases after me. Trail braking does not mean rear brake only.
Trail braking does not mean rear brake only.
Thank you. Trail braking is done primarily with the front brake.
Trail braking is done primarily with the front brake.
There you go. Now, there could be some more things that I would have them say, but generally, the trail braking cornering procedure is basically, it refers to applying the brakes normally as you would come into a turn, but then tapering off your brake pressure or trailing off the brake pressure beyond the entrance of a turn. So if you're in a lean and you haven't released the brakes yet, that would be considered trail braking. All right. So it's a procedure because the first half is the trail braking, you release the brake, but then the second half is the transition as you power out. Now, many people refer to trail braking as rear braking or dragging the rear brake, even in a turn at a sporting pace. And so people have actually argued back and forth, is rear brake what it really means, this and that? Well, we'll be discussing as we go on a little bit more tonight that it just cornering at a sporting pace with the rear brake kind of goes against basic cornering management at its core, okay? Because we'll talk about weight distribution, and also the front hand has more tactile and finer motor skill function as we would brake from our front brake with our right hand. Whereas if we have a foot on a brake pedal, it's more of a clunkier application of the brake. So there's two major points I just made there about why rear brake may not be the best option, okay, for the trail braking technique. Before you can trail brake, you have to have an essential technique basically down, okay? So this is the technique that you need, these techniques here that you really need to possess first before you can, do your trail braking. So one of the things, I'm always trying to figure out a better way to explain something. So let's just first of all talk about just a real simple concept to get in your head. We never want to corner with our right hand in a fist. All right, that means we don't want to be in the corner with our right hand in a fist, because we're going. It's first of all, it's going to reveal that we have lack of control, because our hand is, we can only actually use the throttle now, which is a good control, but we're not able to finish the braking technique transition, and we're kind of just stuck with what our throttle does. We're kind of along for the ride. So you never want to corner with your hand in a fist. Okay, we want to get that, get the brake lever covered. So that's the first thing. Now there's really two parts to the technique. So we're on our throttle, and I call it the roll it up technique. Okay, so we're gonna roll up and close the throttle as we actuate the brake. And what I and many people teach is to use like a two-step braking process. So you would roll off the throttle, and then you use just enough brake light pressure, okay, enough pressure to get the rotors in contact with the pads, okay, and start shifting weight. And then we bring on more power. Okay, we don't want to just roll up and then get on it. We want to get that first initial contact nice and light. And that is the roll it up technique, because we're rolling up our wrist basically. All right. Now that's the first part. The second part of this technique, we're on the brakes, is the roll it down technique. So we're going to release the brake and then roll on the throttle. Now, this is a key component if you're going to trail brake. You have to release the brake lever slowly, gradually, very smoothly before you roll it down. So rolling it down isn't dumping the brake lever and hitting the throttle. It's slowly easing out that brake lever as we roll on, because it's that delicate release of the brake that's going to keep consistent traction when we transition to throttle leaned over when we're trail braking. So what I like to say to simplify it is, I call it the secret weapon technique. Okay. So when I talk about the secret weapon, I'm basically talking about rolling it up and then rolling it down. So we're going to move on to why do it. And like Sharon and I are telling you, and like you're thinking, it gives you more control. And here's why. Okay. A typical corner has a slowest point and a fastest point. All right. So take this curve here. This is just a standard curve, the same curve. Now, if I entered the curve at 20 miles an hour, I will brake. I'll make the transition here. I'll be braking or slowing to here. If I'm going 50 miles an hour into this turn, I will probably want to slow to somewhere near the corner apex. Now, the fastest point of a curve, if you're doing everything right, is going to be at the end of the curve. You're at the highest accelerating out. So what the important part of cornering is getting this down pat, so that we don't make so we make fewer mistakes. And so the trail braking technique, the secret weapon here, is going to allow us to brake to the slowest point. So we're going to brake to the slowest point, and then we're going to accelerate to the fastest point. All right. Now, where to transition depends on your speed. And what I like to think about it as is your lowest miles per hour speed, right? So there's, the slowest point in a turn is another way of saying that is just the lowest miles per hour speed. And so that would be, if you were going to plot your speed on a graph through here, or on a chart of some kind, where the speed is the lowest is probably the point where you're going to transition from brake to throttle. Now, trail braking really isn't a separate technique. It's not this, you got to pull a completely different tool out of your bag. It's all it is familiar techniques of brake throttle transitions, only at different points in the turn, depending on your speed. So it has to do with the timing, all right? So for example, like we'll just, let me go back to the bicycle here. Now, if I'm on my motorcycle and I'm entering into a turn, so I'm going into the turn, let's say it was the first one here. Okay, so we're going to take these in succession. We'll go 20 mile an hour and then I'll enter at 50. Okay, so we'll look at how this looks in those two scenarios. So I'm going slower, I'm on the brake, I'm upright. So now I'm coming into the turn, but I'm at my lowest mile per hour speed basically, and it's time now to lean the motorcycle. So at a lower speed, let's say in the waiver courses, the motorcycle basic rider courses, you let's say release the brake and then look, press and roll. Okay, so the transition would take place while I was still upright. We call this braking or releasing the brake. The second scenario, I'm going a little faster now, and I've rolled off the throttle, I'm on the brake, I'm coming in, and I'm still looking, pressing as I'm holding onto that brake. Now, when I'm at my lowest mile per hour speed and I'm pointed towards the exit, I will release the brake and transition to throttle. So when this transition from brake to throttle happens upright, we call it releasing the brake. When we release the brake leaned in a turn, we call it trail braking. It's the same technique if you're using the secret weapon, okay? So that's the main thing that I'd like to drive home is that trail braking isn't something you have to do separately from what you're already doing if you're using the brake throttle transitions properly. And the trail braking is a secondary benefit of proper brake throttle transition timing. And so if we're covering the brake and we're in this default position, we have instant reaction time. Or what I said earlier at the beginning about how rear brake only, it actually kind of goes against the core of like managing your traction, because where the weight is placed in a cornering situation is very important, okay? So the first has to do with the weight distribution. So we know that weight is going to shift forward when we brake, all right? So even various suspensions out there, the weight is going to pitch forward onto the front tire as we brake towards the entry of the turn. So when I'm coming in on the brakes, and even if I'm nice and easy on the brakes, I'm not causing a severe pitch, there still is less weight on the rear tire. So as I come in, the front tire is going to have a larger contact patch, which is evidence that it has more weight. So we want to weight a tire before fully trusting traction. Okay, so that's just something to think about. Weight a tire before fully trusting traction. So if I'm coming in and there's weight on my front tire, I have trust in that tire to grip. As I ask it and I make a demand for turning traction from the braking traction, okay, I have a limited amount in the pie. What's happening in my rear? Well, it's the contact patch in my rear tire is now lifting, and so it's getting less traction. It's unloading the rear tire. And even if it's still down and getting grip, which it is most of the time, it's you can't argue really against the point of where the weight is shifting. So now, if I'm not using rear brake or not using my front, if I come in, let's just say I do the basic waiver course technique in a spirited sport riding corner, okay, or area, and I'm only carrying rear brake into the turn, trail braking with rear brake, the scenario looks like this. I come in on the brakes. Now, I'm not going to brake in the turn with the front brake, but most people would still enter this turn maybe with both brakes. Most people, if they're going to trail brake with the rear, I would assume they're using their front brake while they're upright. At some point then, you're going to have to curl your hands back on the grip, or I'm assuming many people will curl their hands back on the grip. Maybe they'll leave the front brake lever covered. I don't really know that. But let's say they release the brake, but now they're on their rear brake, and they're going to carry the rear brake in. Well, not only is there less weight on the rear tire, okay, which could allow it to skid, and if you lose the rear, you lose your steering control. But you also, right before you tip in, if you release the brake, it's going to rebound the front forks. And so it's going to, so the idea is if I release the front brake lever before I tip in, or just before, then it's going to unload the weight off the front tire. And now I have a weaker contact patch. All right, we want to weight a tire before fully trusting traction. So if I unweight the tire, as I demand the turning traction, I could overwhelm the front. And again, if I'm entering a turn on my rear brake, I could have a skid in the rear tire because there's not enough weight pushing down on it. Now, a lot of people will say, well, I don't really like to brake. As I corner, I like to use engine braking. Okay, I want to roll off the throttle. And so what happens is that's fine and dandy, and that's going to slow you down. But when you engine brake, it's a very similar effect as using your rear brake. Okay, it's rear wheel traction that's affected. Okay, when you use just coasting. So I coast a lot, which means I'm not using brake or throttle as I enter or at some portion of a corner, but I always have the brake covered, ready to go if I need to slow more than the engine braking is providing, right? The weight distribution, it's very important to use a front weight bias as you're entering a turn. We want weight on the front tire as we go into the turn. So if we hold that brake a little bit past the entry point to our lowest mile per hour speed, we transition at that point, we've weighted the tire. So if the tire's vertically up and down, it's weighted, it's flattening, and then I roll over on it into the turn, a nice rich contact patch. All right, as opposed to releasing the brake, getting rebound, and then hoping that it holds. All right. The other thing was that you might have heard me mention earlier. So the weight distribution, it just goes against using the rear brake in a trail braking situation, and why we want to have a front brake bias. The second thing has to do with the fine motor control function. Okay, so it's very important when you are using brake. It's very important when you're using throttle leaned over. So if I'm in a turn, I can give it too much throttle. That could be a problem. But if you're going to use any go or slow traction while consuming turning traction, it has to be a very gentle action. Okay, it can't be abrupt. It can be, but you're now getting towards the limits of traction. So if I just dump this, or I'm ham-fisted, when I'm using the brake leaned over or the throttle, I could cause trouble with traction. And so that's why with our hand, you can see how we can have really fine motor skill function. If we only rely on a rear brake to trail brake at a sporting pace, we have this big clunky boot, and our foot can really only go up and down. It's not like we have as much dexterity as we do with our hands. And the pedal we could actually put too much weight on that. So we have less of that fine control with the rear brake. So all of these things point to, it's probably not a good idea to trail brake only with the rear brake. Here's how you develop this. So let's say you've heard what we've talked about tonight, you want to work on this. Well, in your normal everyday riding, use brake throttle transitions. Okay, slow, go. Just work on these brake throttle transitions. An afternoon doing brake throttle transitions, you'll get this. Then next time, maybe work up to doing brake throttle transitions in sweepers. Nice gentle turns. And, over time, you'll be able to be, using the technique in switchbacks. But I would caution people this: if you still have in your head sort of a thought that, geez, you can't use brakes in a turn and you're going to just have a malfunction and, use too much brake in a turn, don't risk, your ride doing this technique too early. I mean, you're really going to have trouble, having trouble if you're doing it in a straight line and you're in parking lots and you're just working on your brake throttle transitions. So that would be basically how you develop it. You can also, some of you that may or may not know me, I have a book on Amazon. Everything's in here. These are my lesson plans. What I focused on tonight was chapter 11 out of 12. There's 11 chapters. This is 12 chapters. This is chapter 11, trail braking. And I bring people from, the basement. And then by the time they're done, they're doing the trail braking plus more. I don't call it trail braking confidence because trail braking isn't all there is to it, but it's a big portion of it. So there's a lot more in there. And I have an online course.